Now, last week we started to look at, I introduced anyway, the Kubernetes um, platform tree. And I did mention last week as well that there a research institute within the college here called the Walton Institute. They are providing and managing a Kubernetes cluster for us, which is really what is allowing me to look at this technology, which people I haven't covered it before. It hasn't been covered by any of my colleagues either before, as far as I'm aware. There is a slight problem though, and it is that the cluster that they're managing is having some issues, and that is impacting on us. So I am going to have to park our coverage of Kubernetes for now. And the plan is that I will come back to it at the latter end of this module. Um, so we're actually, you might remember when I was looking at Docker, and I did say to you at the end of the Docker material that there is one other, well, there are probably a number, but there's one other aspect of Docker that we don't know about yet, which is how do we create our own Docker images? And at the time, I was saying I was going to cover that after I've looked at Kubernetes. But because of the issue with the Kubernetes cluster, I'm actually going to look at it now. It's only going to be a lecture, I'd say at most. And if I go back to, when I spoke to you first of all, and I looked at these slides here, if we just quickly go into them, if I fast forward to this slide, so we've done a lot on Docker. The plan was next thing, look at Kubernetes. Then I was going to look at a platform called GitLab CI, which is the platform or the service that we're going to use to address this whole area of CI/CD. So I think I'm going to cover that from next week for a couple of weeks and then come back to Kubernetes. So essentially, bullet point 2 and 3 here are going to be flipped in order. The AWS stuff will actually come in as well when we look at the CI/CD topic. So that's my revised plan of action, Witchy. So that means I want to uh, go back to here, and there's a new set of slides which we look at today, and there's also a new lab, and this lab is the first lab that you will be submitting to me, but that's for tomorrow. So let's work our way through these slides here. Okay, so it's as I said, it's about building our own Docker images. And just to remind ourselves, this is a slide we had from week 1 or week 2, really, where we were contrasting the difference between an image and a container. And we certainly know now what containers are. These are kind of the runtime concepts associated with containerization and with Docker. And what an image is, a container essentially runs an image. So an image we said back then was it's essentially a packaging of an application, but not just the application, but everything that the application needs in order to run. So an image contains the application's code itself, any third-party dependencies that it might require. So if it was a node-based application, a Node.js application, it could be all of the NPM packages that it needs. Plus any operating system level tools that it needs, libraries as well, any configuration files that it might need, whether that be the application itself or configuration of some of the libraries or third-party dependencies. Um, so what an image is essentially the entire file system that is needs to be in place in order for our application code to run properly. And so building an image or creating an image is essentially about constructing the entire file system that's needed. Um, and also it's about uh, creating what we call the environment. So by the environment here, well, I'm actually just saying it, making sure any environment variables, kind of operating system level environment variables, we know what environment variables are, hopefully, making sure that they are correctly initialized for our application, because presumably our application will use these environment variables, or indeed some of the third-party dependencies need some environment variables to be set in order to run properly. So when we talk about building an image or creating an image, essentially it's about creating the file system and the environment variables that need to be in place. And so then when we run a container, it loads in the file system, it initializes the environment variables, and then it runs your application. So how do we create our image? You simply need to create a file that's called this. It has to be called Docker file. We place this file in the base folder of your project. And this Docker file contains, some people call them directives, or others call them instructions, but it's essentially, instructions is probably a simpler word to use. The Docker file contains the set of instructions uh, that need to execute during build time in order to create the file system and the environment variable settings that are required uh, for our particular application. So it's about building up that file system and initializing the environment variables. Um, okay, here's a very simple one, but we kind of skip over really. So this is one instruction, this is another instruction, and there'll be a whole series of these instructions contained inside it in our Docker file. We'll look at the instructions, the most popular or commonly used instructions or directives in the next few slides. But once you have your Docker file, then to build the image, this is the command that you use. Docker build -T for kind of tag. We talk about tagging an image. Tagging really means giving it a name and giving it a version number. If you don't give it a version number, then it will assume the default version, which is latest. And the final thing here, which is really important, the dot at the end. The dot here at the end is essentially telling the build command where it should go to find the Docker file. And we nearly always run this build command from the base folder of our project. And I've said at the top of this slide here that you should put the Docker file into the base folder. So if for some particular reason your Docker file is not in the base folder, then you've got to change this here and point it, essentially, give it a path name of where the Docker file is. But without overstressing it, the common practice is to always put the Docker file in the base folder of your project and to run the Docker build command from the base folder. Okay, so don't forget that dot. That point is made. Okay, and so what the build command does is it executes the instructions in the Docker file kind of one by one. Now, in order to execute them, it is actually creating a temporary container as it executes the instructions in the Docker file. And then at the end of having executed all of the instructions, it essentially snapshots your container's file system and environment, and it just packages that into the image itself. So there are actually containers being created and destroyed uh, during the build process. You never see them, but that is actually what's happening behind the scenes. And in fact, like for each line in this Docker file, uh, at the beginning of the line, it creates a new container. It executes the instruction. Then it snapshots the state of the container at that stage, destroys that container. On the next line in the Docker file, it creates a new container again, initializes that new container with the snapshot that it had created of the file system for the previous instruction, and keeps on working its way down through the Docker file in that kind of fashion. That's kind of happening behind the scenes. You don't really need to see evidence of that. But so in the next few slides, I'm going through the most commonly used instructions in a Docker file. The very first instruction always is the from instruction. And the from instruction is essentially setting a base image for your image. Yeah. So the base image might be the Nginx web server, or the base image might be a particular version of the Node platform. And there are lots and lots of base images available to us on Docker Hub. So if you like, the from instruction, so it might be something like this. What's going to happen is whatever file system exists within this image, that becomes the starting file system for your image. The copy instruction is you use that when you want to copy files from the host machine into the file system of the image. Yeah, and we would always do that, of course. Like, typically, we use the copy command to copy our application code into a particular location in the uh, in the file system of the image that we're building up. And you can use the copy command. It takes this format here: copy space the path name or file from your host machine, and the path name of a location in the images file system. You can use wildcards in the source. If the destination, if this particular path doesn't exist, it's created automatically by the copy command. And here are just some examples. So this example looks, sorry, am I on the right one? Sorry, this one here. This example, it looks like I'm copying the contents of this file. This looks like a particular file, which is in the base folder of my project. And I'm copied into this folder or path within my image. And because I haven't specified a file name here, the file name will be the same as this. In this example, I'm copying the same file, but this time it looks like I want to rename the file inside in the image for whatever reason. Here I'm using a wildcard, so all the configuration files in the base folder of my project on the host machine, I'm copying all of those into this path in the images file system, and here's another example. Okay, so they're all examples of copy commands, and you can have as many copy commands as you need in your Docker file. Sometimes there's only one where you just say copy the entire contents of the base folder in my project, copy all of it into a particular location in the images file system. But you can have more than one, and they don't have to appear beside each other. There may be things that you want to execute between copy commands. The cmd command, that tends to be the last one in the Docker file. And the purpose of the cmd instruction is to explain once once you create a container with your image, then presumably you want the container to run to start up some application. Um, so the CMD command is used to tell the Docker runtime. We need to distinguish between the Docker build time and Docker runtime. Docker build is when we're creating our image. When I use the term Docker runtime, that's when we're actually creating a container that's going to use our image. So when we create a container that's going to use our image, presumably at the end of that container creation, it needs to run our application essentially. But you've got to express in the Docker file, how does it start up our application? Okay, and that's what the CMD command is for. And it tends to, as an argument, this CMD command takes an array where the first entry in the array is like how you start up the application, and the other elements in the array are parameters that the application needs, command line parameters. So here's an example where we're saying we want to start the Nginx server, and here are some command line options that the Nginx server needs. What am I saying? Yeah, sometimes, so when we're using the Docker run command, you can actually override this default startup command. We often refer to this as the container startup command. You can override that with the doc when you're doing Docker run. So normally, in all the cases that we've seen so far, we go Docker run, we go doc. Right, that just keeps jumping in me. Sorry now about that. We go Docker run, maybe some command line options, and then we specify the image. That's what we've done so far. But after the image, you can actually have other arguments here. And these other arguments are essentially telling the Docker daemon, don't run the command that's specified in the CMD part of the Docker file. Actually run this command instead. I don't think we'll ever need to do that, but you may see that being used in some articles that you read. Okay, that's the CMD. That's the CMD command. The run command in a Docker file. What does that do? It executes commands inside the. Okay, so the run command executes a command in the temporary. Remember, I said that as an image is being built, there are temporary containers being used to facilitate the building. Well, sometimes you may actually want to run and in a you want to run a CLI command inside that container during the build process, and you would do that with the run command. I think maybe when we get to seeing an example of this, hopefully it'll make sense, but well, it will make sense, but um, if you want to run a number of commands, then rather than having individual run statements in your Docker file, you can actually sort of chain them together. So in this example here, I want to run apt get update in my temporary container, and I want to run this CLI command in my temporary container, and I want to run this. So there's three things that I want my temporary container to execute during the building of my image. I could have done these as three separate runs. I could have run this, get rid of that bit at the end, then do run this, get rid of the stuff at the end, and do run this. But if you do it that way, it's just slower. Okay. If you want to set some environment variables, which will then be available to your container when you actually want to run your image, you use the env Docker file command. And so it's as simple as this. You just specify the key value pairs of the environment variables that you want to have set. Uh, Sometimes in the Docker file, you set some environment variables, but you want to override those values when you actually come to use the Docker run command and you want to create an actual container with your image. But you want to overwrite the kind of default values for certain environment variables. Well, we know the way you do that is with the -e option when we use the Docker run command. And this -e option will override any values that were set by the env command in the Docker file. The add command is very similar to the copy, except with add, you can actually specify a URL, and typically the URL might contain a link to uh, a zip or some sort of archive. And what the add command will do is it will download that archive and unzip it. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on here. We're saying add, here's the URL of a tar gz file, which is an archive file, and it it will unzip this and place the contents into this folder in my image. Same kind of stuff going on here. If source is a, yeah, you could refer to a local tar file as well. It doesn't have to be a URL based one. Work there. I'm going to come back to that maybe. It kind of sets a default path name for all subsequent commands within your Docker file. So if we switch over to VS Code, so what I'm showing you here is a Node application. It's a simple kind of node-based web server that I've created. And I can run this locally, right? And what it does, this application connects to a Mongo database and it just writes stuff to the Mongo database. Now, I've started up, if I look at my Docker Hub, sorry, not Docker Hub, my Docker desktop, and if I go into containers, you can see here I'm actually running a container that's hosting the Mongo server. Okay, and it's currently running. So that's fine. I just started that earlier on. So there is a date, there's a Mongo database, and I have, can we see it there? Sorry, let's go back to here. You can see that I've uh, port mapped or mapped the server's 27017 port. I've mapped it to my host machine, same port number. So that now means I can reference or access this Mongo database using just localhost colon 27017. And here I've got a simple node-based server application that does actually connect to a Mongo database. And it assumes the Mongo database. If I look at the environment variable settings here, you can see some of the environment variable settings relate to my Mongo database. So I'm assuming that my Mongo database kind of root user is called admin, which it is. Their password is secret. The Mongo server is available at localhost, which it is because I've used port mapping with my, as I just said. And the port that's used the port by which I can access my Mongo database is 27017. That's 27017 at localhost now. And that's going to work for me because of what I've just shown you in my Docker desktop. And the last one, well, that's okay. That's not being used here, I don't think. Uh, is it being used localhost? Oh, it is actually. That's just, this is going to be the domain name for my node uh, server application over here. Okay. And if I want to run this, it's actually running at the moment, but I'll just stop it. If I want to run it, now it's a node-based application, so you can see it has a package.json, um, and that's fine. And I suppose the key starting point for this node-based application is this file here, server.js. Okay, and that just starts up an Express kind of web server. And down at the bottom, then we were listening for connections. Where do we do that? Here we're listening for connections to our web server at, in our case, it will be at port 3000. And I'm kind of grabbing the port here. Where do I grab the port? Here. I grab the port from an environment variable, and I've set that environment variable in my .env file. So that's good. Have I hard coded it to? Oh no, I'm also accessing. Let's see, where do I access that? Process.env. I should refer to host somewhere. I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it. So if I just start my server, now I haven't containerized this. This is my application that I want to containerize. Okay. I suppose the other thing I should just highlight as well is that, okay, here's my base folder. Now my Docker file is actually there now, and I'll show you that in a moment. The actual application in my case is inside in the app folder. There's no particular reason why I did that, but it is anyway, okay? So, and when we open up that, then this is essentially kind of the starting point, the server.js, this one here, okay? So in order to run this server application locally, I first need to cd down into the app folder, which I've done already. Let's just confirm that. If I do pwd, you can see that I'm inside in the app folder. And if I now just go node server.js, that's going to run, it's going to run this server.js file essentially, yeah. It's going to run this, and that's going to start up my node web server. It's also going to connect to my database. Again, if we go into that file, you can see here I'm importing ./db /index. That's where I just have my code for connecting to the Mongo database. I am here, I'm kind of constructing the connection string from my Mongo database, and it's using a lot of environment variables you can see there. And those environment variables are being pulled from my .env file. And then I just try to console log it for convenience. Here's where I try to connect to my Mongo database. You don't need to worry about all of this code, okay? It works. The only code you might have a look at is server.js, because there's a little exercise in the lab that will require you to poke around that file. But let's start and there's only one web page. You can see index.html. So this web application only has one page in it, and you can look at that later yourselves. So if I now start my application and I can get at the home page of my application by simply going to open up a tab, localhost 3000, and that's the home page. Okay. Why was it localhost 3000? Because my end file said that, or that's what it set the environment variables for. It set app host to localhost and port to 3000. Just going to do a quick look for app host because I kind of skimmed over that. It must be defaulting to it. Why is it not picking that up? Okay, I don't want to waste time on it. Maybe it defaults to it, but I can override it. Right. So, and just to all, I mean, there's very little you can do with this application. The only thing you can do is change these things here, and it updates the database. If I go over to, I've also got Mongo Express running as well, which is looking at my database. So if I go to localhost 8081, you're familiar with Mongo Express. Yeah, and this is the database, and this is the collection. And there's the actual confirmation of the kind of record. It's set to my name is, does it give my username? Oh yeah, the name is Diarmid. Now, if I go back to my application and I want to change those things, so I go click this first, I'll change it to my full name. I'll leave it at that. Click update. Did it change it? Refresh. Yep, it changed it over here. So that's fine. That all works. But we're not really interested in that. What we're really interested in is creating a Docker image of this application. And that brings us to our Docker file. So here we go from the top down. First of all, what's my base image? I've picked version 20 dot something of Node. Okay, that's not what version I picked isn't really that important, but I've just arbitrarily selected that. So that's my base image. And if we looked inside that base image, we'd see the kind of file system, the initial file system that comes with that. Next, I'm setting some environment variables. So these are environment variables that are relevant to my application. And if you kind of scan down through them, Mongo user, Mongo pass, Mongo host, they're the exact same environment variables that I have in my M file. So that's not a coincidence. So that's the env, that's the from command. This is the env command. Some of the environment variables I've left as blank. So, and I say in the lab, because you walk through this in the lab now, I say that, The sensitive ones you might leave blank, and you force the user then to specify values for these environment variables when they use the Docker run command. Um, then I'm using the run command, and so what it's doing is it's executing this inside in my image. And we know what the mkdir Linux instruction does. It just creates a new folder or a new path inside in my images file system. Uh, what workdir, I kind of skipped over that one in the slides. What workdir does is it sets this path name as being the default path name for all subsequent directives in your Docker file. And we'll see where that becomes useful later on. Okay, so I'm setting that, and you can set any path name, but this is the one that I'm using. Then I have my copy command, and I'm going copy./app. So I'm essentially copying the entire contents of this app folder, all the subfolders as well. Copying all of those into dot. What is dot? Dot is this here. So I'm copying all the contents of the app folder from my host into my images file system, and I want them placed inside in this path here. If I didn't have workdir, then I would simply take this and stick it in there. Either or. Yeah. But it's just more convenient to do it the way to use workdir. We'll undo that. Then I am using the run command because I need to also have all of the node modules, this node modules folder, that needs to be inside in my image as well. Now, I don't want to copy those. You could use the copy command to do that, but because there's such a high volume of files, then the better way to do it is by actually running npm install as part of my image construction sequence. And the npm command, that will work because my base image, and this is kind of an important point, my base image is a version of Node. If I use another base image, then when I try and build my image here, this line will actually fail because it'll say there is no utility called npm available to me. So that's why it's important to pick the right base image. So I'm running npm install as part of the build process. That happens, this executes during build time now. This doesn't execute during container runtime. Next, I didn't mention this one in the slides, but you nearly guessed it. This is how I can expose a port for my runtime container when I eventually want to run a container that's using my image, and I want that container to expose a port. This is how you do it. And you might remember I'm running my application on port 3000. And the final instruction in my Docker file is the CMD one. And that's saying, look, once you, at runtime, when you create an actual container with this image, the last thing you should do is execute this instruction, or execute this command, CLI command. And it's the exact command that I ran down here when I wanted to run my application locally, node server .js. So that's my Docker file. I use docker build and point this at it. That's going to create the image. And then I run my image using docker run just as before. Give it my image name and pass any environment variables that I want to that runtime container. If I do, then any values that I pass will override these kind of default values. I'd certainly want to explicitly tell it what Mongo pass should be set to. Otherwise, my application won't be able to connect to the database server. And that is about it for this example. And this is what you will walk through in the lab tomorrow. So what else do I need to tell you, I wonder? I'm just curious about, let me just do something here. Okay, I'm curious as to why it's not picking up that. Sorry, now I should have checked this beforehand, but we'll just check the env again. App host, looks like that's not being used, which is kind of throwing me a little bit. This one isn't being used. Okay, I'll look at it after the lecture and clarify it with you tomorrow if it needs be. So quickly again, uh, this is the file that creates our image for us. And when we use the docker build command, I mean, I suppose we could do that, but need to probably done it already. So what I'm actually going to do is go into my Docker Hub images. Let's search for profile. Okay, it doesn't seem to be there at all. That's okay. Let's do a Docker build in that case. Here's the Docker build command. And now that I look at it, I think it's actually, that's missing some stuff. Oh, sorry. No, sorry. It's okay. Yeah, sorry. That's okay. The minus E option is wrong there. There is no minus E option. Minus E option is when you try and do a Docker run, not a Docker build. That was poor of me. I think this is that. Oh, I think is that the problem? If I get rid of that, the end, go back to here. I'll just do a rebuild, but this time I'll set it to, sorry, we don't need all of that. Where is it getting that from? Grab this again. Did I build the right image there? Okay, it's happy this time. I think I must have built the wrong image in the previous. That's the build that ran previously. Sorry about that. I didn't even check to see that it was doing the right one. Anyway, it's built this one correctly for me. And if I check in my images, If I check and look for something called profile, okay, there's my image. And then I can run that image, which is what we do in the lab. And we do need to set some environment variables. We need to set these two environment variables because in the Docker file, they were left empty for, as I say, for security reasons. Right. That's it. That's okay. There is other stuff about Docker files that we could look at, but we have the essentials at this stage. And so you need to work through this lab tomorrow, and I will touch base with you tomorrow. I'll pause in case there are any questions. Some of the stuff that I showed you now today was a little bit clumsy in my part, so apologies about that. Any closing questions? They're never hard, but no. Okay. I will touch base with you tomorrow in the lab. Thanks. Bye bye.